Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about working in another's game IP. This is not me talking about taking a non-game IP and turning it into a game. I have a whole video on that. I'm talking about you're making a game in someone else's game world. Maybe it's a tabletop and you're converting it to a video game, which is a slight change of medium. Or maybe you're making a sequel in someone else's game world. Or maybe you're working in a game where someone else is doing most of the design work. I want to talk about that because it's an interesting feeling and an interesting process to be involved in something like that. But before I do, I want to tell you guys a story. It wouldn't be a Kanon Games video, would it, without a story? I've also never told this story before, ever. So let me caveat it with this. To the presenter, I am not making fun of you, and I'm going to remove identifying characteristics. I've never told this story because it makes it sound like some people interpret it as I'm making fun of the person giving the presentation, and I am not. I'm talking about me in this story, how I felt. So without giving too many details, also I didn't write down a lot of details, so I don't remember some things. Years after Troika was closed, I was invited to a meeting. The person who was inviting me was very vague about it. He just said, I think it will interest you greatly. And I had time, so I was like, okay, I'm going to go to this meeting. And the meeting was in a conference room that was big enough that having an extra person there wasn't really noticed. The person giving the presentation, I don't think, he didn't know half the people in the room. He certainly didn't care that there was an extra person sitting on the far side of a big conference room. I'd say there was probably 10 people there that he was presenting to. Anyway, so the presentation starts, and he's making a game, and I honestly cannot remember the genre. It was just, all I can tell you, it wasn't an RPG. And he starts talking about a game he wants to make, and it's a proposal for the design, and I'm like, oh, I must be here to look at the system mechanics. And he said, we're making this game based on an old game called Arcanum. Whoosh, laser focus. This guy had my full 100% undivided attention. But let me tell you something. The person who invited me wasn't looking at the presenter. He was looking at me. I was the show. I was the entertainment. I don't get reaction videos on YouTube. People love watching someone watch something else. I just want to watch the other video. I want to see the source material. I'm uninterested in watching someone react to someone else. But I get it. It's super popular. A lot of you love it. Well, the guy who invited me, I was his reaction video. He spent more time looking at me than the presenter. The other thing I want to make clear is they were just using the Arcanum setting. It was not an RPG. They weren't interested in the mechanics, not really, as much as you could divorce those from the setting. Because remember, I always tell people, do setting, then story, then system mechanics. So the setting is going to have some system mechanics that support it, so it's kind of hard to tease those apart if you do the setting first. I did ask one question during his presentation. I said, do you have the license for it? And he responded, we're currently in negotiations with Activision, and we're pretty positive we're going to get the rights. That is a very long way of saying no, they did not have the rights. So this should tell you this was a time where it had been long enough after Troika collapsed that Sierra had been sold to Havas, had been sold to Activision. So that's who had the rights. I didn't say anything else. I just listened to him explain Arcanum. Now let me tell you how surreal that was. I sat there listening to some stranger explain Arcanum's setting to me for use in a non-RPG game. I wish my notes were more detailed because I'm just mainly going on feeling here. I remember going, some of what he said was right, and it was mostly factual things. This country did exist, and yes, they were having this kind of issue, and yes, there were these kind of different races, and here's how they were kind of portrayed. A lot of what he said wasn't right, but it wasn't factually wrong. It was just his interpretation of what Arcanum was saying was so not what we had intended that it was sort of bizarre listening to it. And it made me understand they were making an RPG, and part of his interpretation of Arcanum was the part of it that supported this non-RPG game. Like I said, I didn't say anything. I just watched. Afterwards, of course, the person who invited me, what'd you think of that? And all I tell him is, that was really surreal. That's all I really said. And I've never told that story to anyone. I've never said in an interview like, wow, I watched someone explain Arcanum to me. Now, this, by the way, that kind of stuff isn't new. I've had people explain what Fallout means to me countless times. I have a video called Capitalism and a follow-up called Intent. They're linked below, where you can see people again and again and again explain to me what Fallout was. Now, their interpretation is fine. But when they start to say, and this is the intent, this is what the team's intent was, that's wrong. Similarly, when I was watching this Arcanum presentation, I was getting that a lot of this was his interpretation, but he was portraying it as this was the game's intent. And I was like, ooh, this is weird. And I've mentioned in another video, and I don't remember which one it was, where I watched someone explain Fallout's visual style to the art director. And as a colorblind programmer, let me just repeat, I didn't have a dog in that hunt. But wow, was it fun to watch. So I kind of got why the guy invited me there, because he wanted to watch me react to someone explaining Arcanum to me. I've watched Leonard react to someone explaining Fallout's visual style to him. All of this has made me realize how much people see things through their own lens. Everybody has their own POV. I've talked about this a lot. What's weird, though, to me is I knew that. I have my own lens, too. It's why I tell you guys all these stories, so you can understand my lens and then interpret what I tell you later through my lens. But I've encountered more and more people who require everything to fit their lens, and they will ignore anything that doesn't fit, that's factual, and anything that can be interpreted will get a spirited, almost angry defense of smushing it into their lens to force it in, even if it doesn't really fit. They'll find a way of forcing it in. And I know some of you are probably thinking, he's talking politics. I'm not talking politics, but I really am still talking game development here. Everybody has their own point of view, and wow, will they force a square peg into a round hole. Conversely, I've been called wishy-washy more than once. I've been told, just decide, just make a decision, more than once. Because when I'm presented with something and asked what I think, I start to give the pros and cons of it. Well, I like this setting because of these reasons, but it will have this problem. Or I like this system mechanic, but we're going to have to figure out how to fix this. Now, let me tell you, this is actually a good thing to have, because the people who try to shove things into their lens ignore the faults, and then you end up with a game going out with a problem that could have easily been fixed if you had just acknowledged it. But I do this on everything. I do this on system mechanics. I do this on storyline. I do this on UX. I talk about the pros and cons. And I like getting feedback from people on it. It's interesting getting feedback on how my ideas fit into other people's IPs. Like when Troika was working on the Lord of the Rings game, I loved it when they sent a Tolkien expert to talk to us. And there's a video below where I talk about that demo. He had a breadth of knowledge that was incredible. But even then, we found some things that were factually incorrect, not interpretations that were wrong. He said something and I'm like, that's not true. And luckily, like Jason Anderson had just skim read the Silmarillion, and he said, if you look on this page, and we were right. It was a factual thing. But on the interpretation stuff, I'm going to bow to the Tolkien expert. Similarly, and I've talked about this, when I made Temple of Elemental Evil, I got to talk to Gary Gygax. I think it was in my Brushes with Famous People video. I got to talk to him about what he intended in the module, because I could read all the facts from the module, but I didn't want to read what intent was. And there were some places that were vague, and so I got to find out intent from the man himself. Similarly, when I worked on Pillars of Eternity, I worked on that IP. I don't consider it an IP that I was a creator of. It was Josh Sawyer's. I made classes for that, but I loved getting Josh Sawyer's feedback, and they got changed from my initial design because it's his IP. I love that kind of work when I'm working in someone else's IP. And I would never tell any of those creators that their ideas were wrong. The closest I ever got was, hey, this thing you want to do, this idea you want to do, would be very, very hard to implement. With Gygax, it was the idea of, a sword, a special sword, and a special class that doesn't really fit in with all the rules. And with the computer, you got to have rules. For Josh, it was some stuff I thought should be expressed more about the player character that I didn't think was coming across. But that was that's completely subjective. Similarly, and I've mentioned this, I've gotten postmortems after one of my games have shipped that I did do the design on from people on the team. Somebody gave me a postmortem for Temple who worked on the team. I got several postmortems because I asked for them from team members on The Outer Worlds. They're great. It's great to get that kind of feedback. In fact, it's so obvious to me that you would want that kind of feedback that's why I sent my postmortems for Fallout 3 and 4 to Bethesda. I just assumed they'd want them. I never heard back, didn't need to, but you have to remember that the place I was coming from was Fallout was something I had a big hand in creating, and they did invite me to E3 to get a preview of Fallout 3. And then afterwards, Todd Howard, Pete Hines, and Emil Paglario, I hope I'm saying that right, we all had lunch together, and we talked about what I had seen. So I assumed they would be interested. They were interested at that lunch. I assumed they'd be interested in the postmortems. And my postmortems were, okay, here's all the things that I thought worked, and here's the things that I thought didn't work. But by the way, I'm never going to put those postmortems on here, and I know you guys will ask, because those postmortems were for them. They weren't for you. They were for them. Now, I personally like getting other people's interpretation of my games. I love hearing it. When I talked about intent, I tried to make that clear. I love hearing what you guys thought my games were about, because that's great. It's one of the reasons I like making my own IP and not working with in someone else's, because I know what the intent is, so I love to hear your interpretation. When I'm working in someone else's IP, first of all, I have to interpret, and interpretation is hard. Or conversely, interpretation is very easy to do, but your interpretation may be so personal, so non-universal, that no one else will agree with your interpretation. A good universal interpretation is very hard to create. Also, extension is hard. There was only one game with Arcanum. So when I watched that guy give his presentation, I remember thinking, there's only one game. One game is a point. He didn't know what direction we were going to go. He didn't have access to our Journey to the Center of Arcanum docs. But once there's two games, you kind of have an idea. But it's still only an idea. Maybe it's a straight line. Maybe the game's going to go that way. Maybe it's a parabola. So you got point. Maybe the third game would have been here and the fourth game would have been here. So the game would have gotten crazier or gone off the rails on one axis. And that was the intent. But you don't know when you only have one game. So I can't blame this guy explaining Arcanum to me based on one game. The other thing that's hard about converting one game into another, or making a second or third game, is what I call transposition. And I'm stealing this from music, where like guitar gets transposed to piano. It's not translation, because there are some things you can't do in one. What I use transposition for is, for example, turning a turn-based game to a real-time game is transposition. You have to convert so many other things. When BioWare made AD&D in Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 from a turn-based game to a real-time game, they had to change a bunch of rules. And in my mind, that makes it a little not AD&D. That's not, AD&D is turn-based. They made a interpretation of AD&D, real-time on a computer. Same thing when you go from an isometric game to a first-person game. There are things you have to change to make that work. I think those are useful things to do, to advance the game, to extend the game. But that kind of transposition is subject to interpretation. Some people like it, some people don't. For all those reasons, that's why I find working in someone else's game world to be hard. And if I had my own way, I'd only make new IPs. I wouldn't work in someone else's. Anyway, that's my thoughts on actually making games based on someone else's games.